So let's now dive into hooks. If you took your time to go through these tests, it should now be clear what I'm testing there. The class which I'm testing, of course, deliberately, is also a quite straightforward and simple class. But if you went through these tests, there's one thing you might have noticed. There's a lot of repetition across all these tests. In all my tests, I'm creating new user objects, and I'm always setting this test email address. Now, repeating all that code isn't bad, and there are definitely people who would argue that every test should work standalone and you should have this duplication so that every test really has all it needs, and that is a valid point of view. But if you want to reduce the code duplication a little bit, there would be ways of doing so. For example, you could take this test email constant, which I'm using in all my tests, and you could cut it from the first test and add it as a global constant in this file, and then get rid of all the redefinitions of this constant in all the other tests. Since it's now a global constant, it will be available in all those test functions. And now we saved some code and we have this global test email constant, which is used in all these tests. And again, this is definitely not something you have to do, and some people would consider it wrong, but it can be something you might want to do, and that's why I want to show it to you. Now, this is not a hook, but this is already something that is worth noting, that you can have such global values. And now that we got this global value here, we could of course also try to do the same with the user, because I'm also always creating the user object in all these tests. So therefore, if I cut this, I can also add my user here and then get rid of all these user recreations in all these tests, like this. If I now save this, we saved some code, or we reduced our code, and now let's try running this again. And you will notice that now we get a failing test. I didn't show it before, but before all tests would have worked. If you quickly undo all those changes and you run the tests, you will see that they work. Initially, all tests passed, but now we get a failing test. And the failing test is the one where we expected the provided email value to be stored. So this test here. Here we expect user email to be test email. And that makes sense, right? We have this test email, we create a user with that test email, so it would make sense that we expect the user to have this test email. Now maybe something's wrong in our code. But if you take a look at this code, you will quickly see that nothing's wrong with it. We get an email in the constructor here and we're storing it, so it should be available. And yet our test fails. The reason for this, and that's super important and something which can often be overlooked, is that our testing file is a standard JavaScript file in the end, and all the code there executes according to standard JavaScript rules. And in the end, with all those it functions here, we're just registering a bunch of tests which are all registered after each other. Now that means that now that we refactored our code and we have the global user and the global test email, this test here, which fails, does no longer initialize the user for this test. Instead, we're using the global user, and all the tests that were registered prior to this test did manipulate that user object already. Specifically, this test did assign a new email address. And since this test was executed after this test and was registered after this test, this updated email address is now stored when this test executes. And therefore, the updated email address indeed doesn't match our test email address anymore. So now, because of our outsourcing, we have the problem that our tests don't work anymore, but not because the underlying code would be bad, but because our testing code is bad, so to say. And that's a problem we can solve with help of hooks.